Hello everyone. Who, what, when, where, why, how, or as it is commonly known, 5 W's and 1 H, is a tried and true method of analysis, or of approaching the task of writing an article, review, speech, or narrative characterized by clarity and thoroughness. Both as a reader and as a writer, we need to be critical thinkers and problem solvers in order to discern the subject matter and have a clear understanding of the meaning and purpose of the text. In this video, I apply this questioning framework to the task of interrogating a text. The 5 W's and 1 H will help us to unpack my poem, The Architecture of Adulthood. Let's read it together. The Architecture of Adulthood. Adulthood begins with the shedding of the old school skin, exposing incidents which will echo through the coming years, amplified by dark tunnels of teenage angst. Like bats, they send out their high-frequency ultrasonic sound and their memories bounce back through the restless dark. Sarcastic comments that pass for wit, slights that stung like sticks and stones on brittle bones, and staggering syllogistic stereotypes. All Asians are maths geniuses. Manny is Asian, therefore Manny must be a maths genius. As the shining, snake-shaped shell peels off, prettily printed, freshly minted adults slither out, a facade of fearlessness masking their sense of vulnerability without their familiar boundaries. Released from the old curse of crawling in the dust, they strut self-consciously on awkward legs like a phys ed class teetering on stilts. Here and there, the foolhardy fanfares of false bravado bellow their battle cries before their pride comes tumbling down. Stunned, they stagger out of the rubble, floundering like drunken parrots high on fermented fruit. Flapping futilely, they fall from the sky, one after the other, with the dazed arrogance of a roguish Aussie Icarus. How do they build on this jumbled bundle of broken bits strewn across the bloodied asphalt of adolescence? That is the great challenge facing the architects of adulthood. Overwhelmed by the demands of their daylight hours, these bewildered teens begin to build their nighttime habitats of straw and broken sticks, while harried parents wring their hands and will them to choose bricks. Now we will apply the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions to this poem. Once you've learnt this analytical framework, you can then apply these questions yourself to any poem you're reading. Moreover, once you become used to this questioning approach to a text, it will become a natural way for you to begin your own poem or any other writing task. More often than not, just starting a writing task seems like a huge hurdle to clear before you can run to the finishing line. With the 5 W's, you'll be halfway down the track within minutes as all the elements of who, what, when, where, and why come together, and you are left with the how. How to convey your message and achieve your purpose in the most powerful way. In their simplest form, the 5 W's apply to the subject of the writing, the action or event taking place, when it is taking place, and the location and reason this is happening. But texts are complicated. Don't be content with one question in each category. If you're watching a crime thriller, for instance, you might ask, who committed the crime? Who saw the crime being committed? Who discovered it? Who are the suspects? Who is investigating the crime? Who is acting suspiciously? Who is telling the story? Who are they hoping to influence? Etc., etc. Notice how many who questions can be asked about this text. Think of this approach to the text as a forensic investigation, where every word and every nuance of every word might be a clue that leads you to the treasure hidden in the depths of the poem's architectural structure. There are countless questions beginning with who that need to be asked by the reader or asked by the writer. For example, if you are writing a poem, here are some of the possible who questions. Who is the poem about? Who else is present? Who is the intended reader? Who is the speaker of the poem, the poet or another character? It could even be an object speaking. The speaker of one of my poems is a derelict house on Marion Road. Through the house, the modern reader is taken on a historical tour that may be nostalgic for older readers and revealing and surprising for younger ones. Another question we might ask is, who is being addressed? In this case, a wide age range of readers is being addressed, but it would be of most interest to those in South Australia, particularly those driving down Marion Road on a regular basis. In another instance, I have written a letter poem addressed to Coca-Cola, using personification to bring the health problems of this drink to the attention of the reader in a humorous way that is more likely to disarm their defences than facts and finger-wagging. Let's have a quick look at it. Dear Coke, we didn't even have a television when you first hit the shops. It was back in the olden days when girls wore bobby socks and boys greased their hair and wore white grandpa jocks. It didn't take long till you were top of the soft drink pops, but people started drinking so much we needed a sugar detox. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Zero sugar Coke really rocks. Sorry, I have to sign off now. Just wanted to give you props. Your most ardent fan, Foxy Locks. Who is being addressed in this poem? Of course, Coke. Who else is being addressed? The young reader, who the writer hopes will heed this warning against imbibing excessive sugar in their diets, symbolised here by Coke. All right, let's get back to my poem, The Architecture of Adulthood, and just read it through once more so that you can become more familiar with it. The Architecture of Adulthood. Adulthood begins with the shedding of the old school skin, exposing incidents which will echo through the coming years, amplified by dark tunnels of teenage angst. Like bats, they send out their high-frequency ultrasonic sound and their memories bounce back through the restless dark. Sarcastic comments that passed for wit, slights that stung like sticks and stones on brittle bones, and staggering syllogistic stereotypes. All Asians are maths geniuses. Manny is Asian, therefore Manny must be a maths genius. As the shining, snake-shaped shell peels off, prettily printed, freshly minted adults slither out, a facade of fearlessness masking their sense of vulnerability without their familiar boundaries. Released from the old curse of crawling in the dust, they strut self-consciously on awkward legs like a phys-ed class teetering on stilts. Here and there, the foolhardy fanfares of false bravado bellow their battle cries before their pride comes tumbling down. Stunned, they stagger out of the rubble, floundering like drunken parrots high on fermented fruit. Flapping futilely, they fall from the sky one after the other with the dazed arrogance of a roguish Aussie Icarus. How do they build on this jumbled bundle of broken bits strewn across the bloodied asphalt of adolescence? That is the great challenge facing the architects of adulthood. Overwhelmed by the demands of their daylight hours, these bewildered teens begin to build their nighttime habitats of straw and broken sticks, while harried parents wring their hands and will them to choose bricks. So, To summarise, who, what, when, where, why, how provides a framework to help you unpack any poem as well as write one. Now let's propose some useful questions for unpacking the meaning and purpose of the architecture of adulthood. We will look at each of the key questions which are written in bold and possible answers. In the suggested answers, I have highlighted the key meta-language of poetry analysis to remind you of the poetic devices you should be identifying, as these are used by poets to convey their themes, messages, and purpose. In other words, the whole point of the poem. Now, let's apply the who questions to the architecture of adulthood, which you can find on page 44 in my first poetry collection, Infinite Connections, if you have a copy. First question, who is the speaker of the poem? This is always a good place to start. In this case, it is the poet herself who speaks about teenagers and their parents who are being presented through the poet's eyes, from the poet's perspective, writing in the third person as she looks back from a mature perspective at the transition to adulthood that we all pass through. Sometimes it is interesting to note whose voices we don't hear. For example, we don't hear the teenagers or the parents' voices. We see it all from the poet's point of view. Some other questions might be, who is the central focus? Here, of course, it is teenagers. We might also ask who else is present. In this case, the parents. Who is alluded to? Well, there are a lot of allusions. The serpent in Genesis, Adam and Eve, Icarus, the three little pigs, and the children's chant, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. We need to identify who is the intended audience as well. Teenagers and their parents, and those looking back at this time of life, are targeted in this case. The poet wants them to think about the challenges of this period in their lives. Remember, the questions you ask in each category will depend on what is relevant to the poem. Let's go on to the what questions, starting with, what is the central focus? The poem focuses on the transition from teenager to adult, experienced by the teenager, but also by their parents, as observed by the poet in 4 stanzas. What is the theme? Well, in this case, it's growing up or maturing. And what is the main message? Well, the poem is telling us that transitioning from a teenager to an adult with responsibilities is not easy for teenagers or their parents. Another important what question to ask is, what draws our attention to the main message? The title and the allusions to the chant and the 3 little pigs, as well as to Genesis and Icarus, are used to engage us in the theme and messages. Next, we come to the when questions. When is the poem set? It is a modern setting, but of a general nature. In other words, it could apply to any decade. It focuses on the teenage years of any generation as they transition from school to life in the workplace or further education. When does the action take place? In some poems, it may specify a season. For example, Keats has a famous poem called Ode to Autumn. Or the poem may be a historical era or be set during an event such as a presidential inauguration or a pandemic. Many people, including me, have written poems about the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on them and their communities. In the architecture of adulthood, it is set during the teenage years, which could be in any era. Let's consider a couple of where questions. Where does the action take place? Here, the images are predominantly in a schoolyard setting, specifically the phys ed class, but it also alludes to nightclubs and other places of leisure where teenagers engage in unproductive, foolish, irresponsible, and even destructive behaviours. setting aside all the fun, of course, for the purpose of the poem. Where does the poet take the reader? That's another possible question. The poet takes the older reader into their memory banks to the teenage years. The poet describes this period of life by taking the reader back to famous stories of human hubris and humiliation in Genesis and Greek mythology, as well as evoked by an old schoolyard chant and a nursery rhyme. This builds empathy with the reader as their own memories are aroused. The next series of questions are the why questions. These are very important because poets write for a purpose, and the reader's task is to ascertain that purpose if they're going to fully understand the poem. So we need to ask, why did the poet write the poem? The poet's purpose was to draw attention to the difficulties teenagers face in coping with the demands of school and then life after school, and the added responsibilities which they are expected to assume as an adult. The poet was also drawing attention to the parents' anxiety about their teenagers' future, demonstrating that the teens are not the only ones who find these years challenging. Why did the poet link the transition to adulthood to architecture? Architecture alludes to the idea of building something sturdy and fit for purpose, and all parents hope that their child will become a strong and mature adult, able to take responsibility for themselves and their communities. Another question to ask might be, why did the poet allude to Genesis, Greek mythology, schoolyard chants and fairy tales? These allusions reinforce two challenges to achieving maturity: pride and lack of wisdom or circumspection. Now we come to the most important questions of all, the how questions. How does the poet present the subject matter? How does the form support or reflect the subject of the poem? How does the poet draw attention to these themes and messages of the poem through the poetic devices used? Why and how are the two most important questions of a poem. We need to understand the poet's purpose, the why, and we acquire that understanding through the poetic devices, the how, that are used by the poet to draw attention to the messages and purpose. To summarize, poetic devices are used to engage the reader and convey the subject, theme, tone, message, and purpose of a poem. Let's consider the title first. The title is the first engagement with the poem and can act as a hook that intrigues the reader or evokes an emotive response. Alliteration, emotive language, and imagery can draw attention to the subject and influence the reader's response. It can position them to think in a certain way about the subject. In the architecture of adulthood, the alliteration draws attention to the intriguing combination of two words not usually considered in relation to each other. This acts as a hook to engage the reader's attention. Later, the reader will see how these two ideas, architecture and adulthood, are connected through the allusion to the fairy tale of the three little pigs, which is a story that reinforces the idea that we need to mature and take responsibility for ourselves and our lives as we grow older, captured through the metaphor of architecture and, metaphorically speaking, building maturity. Form can also help the poet to achieve their purpose. In this case, the form mirrors prose in that it tells a story and is divided into stanzas that are the equivalent of paragraphs, with a beginning that produces the subject of teenagers transitioning to adulthood, then moving through examples of challenges as the tension rises before coming to a tense but hopeful conclusion. The free verse form helps establish the storytelling element of this poem. And alliteration, along with the stanzas, help to provide a sense of rhythm and logic to the storytelling. So we see form is a fundamental element of the how question. Let's look at imagery next. Imagery is used as an important vehicle for conveying the idea of gradual transformation into adulthood as we develop greater maturity. From the outset, I have used a metaphor of shedding a snake's skin, which is further developed in the middle of the second stanza in the line, "released from the old curse of crawling in the dust." This alludes to being made from dust and the curse of the serpent who led Adam and Eve astray. This infers an implied question: can we mature and outgrow our hubris as we become adults? I think we all know the answer to that optimistic question. We can only hope we can to some extent. The entire first stanza piles metaphor upon metaphor, such as the echo and the dark tunnels in the comparison with bat signals bouncing back in the dark like memories. An ironic allusion to a schoolyard chant that belies the reality that names do hurt us and can continue to do so over time, used alliteration to draw attention to this fallacious belief and to the stereotyping that is also hurtful. By seeing an example of a syllogism based on stereotypes in brackets, the reader is forced to consider the skewed logic of stereotyping in more depth. At the same time, they are being taken into the poet's confidence because brackets put the comment into the category of an intimate aside that usually occurs between two like-minded friends. This was a favoured device of Bruce Dorr, who liked to supposedly whisper something in his reader's ear in expectation that they shared his view or deserved to be taken into his confidence like a favoured friend. Tone is another important element that needs to be unpacked. How does the poet convey a tone? Well, tone is conveyed primarily through the choice of vocabulary, but also through images and actions. Tone may also change throughout the poem. For example, this poem begins by establishing a nostalgic, somewhat tortured tone through the evocation of harsh and hurtful memories, and this slides into dark, self-mocking humour in the wry acknowledgement that this description applies to all of us as we look back on our teenage years. It is achieved through the comparison with bats in their dark, sightless state, and the metaphor of the snake shedding its skin, just as we shed our teenage persona and try to fit into our new adult skin, so to speak. Also, the metaphor of the dark tunnels representing our unhappy memories helps to build this tone through exaggeration. In the second stanza, the tone becomes more sympathetic to the challenges of growing up, using vocabulary that exposes the sense of vulnerability, such as the description of them strutting self-consciously on awkward legs, and the alliterated phrase, foolhardy fanfares of false bravado. The balancing act of transitioning to adulthood is achieved through the symbolic imagery of students using stilts in phys ed, and it also adds humour by contrasting that with their previous state of slithering in the dust with its added layer of allusion to human hubris through the story of Adam and Eve tempted by the serpent to usurp God's role. Humour is built on in the third stanza through the simile that compares them to drunken parrots. The second and third stanzas use behavioural humour similar to slapstick humour based on the actions and exaggerations. Stanza 3 continues to draw attention to their behaviour through alliteration and the simile describing them as floundering like drunken parrots high on fermented fruit and flapping futilely before succumbing to the consequences of their vain silliness, which is being compared to Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, causing the wax that held his artificial wings on to melt and causing him to fall into the sea and drown. The choice of vocabulary and the metaphor of the bloodied asphalt of adolescence symbolises the many ways we fall victim to our hubris and vulnerability as teenagers. The rhetorical question changes the tone from humorous to pensive and concerned. So you can see there are multiple devices that show us how the poet conveys tone throughout a poem, and of course that tone is reflective of the poet's attitude. Now we come to the conclusion. How we conclude is very important. It should convince the reader of the poet's point of view. It should also cause him to think more about the themes and messages and to evaluate the truth of the poem and the worthiness of the messages being conveyed. In this case, the poet uses a contrast in choices through an allusion to the three little pigs in order to convey the message that it is an anxious time for parents as they watch their child making poor choices that are unsustainable, unsafe, and irresponsible as they go through the transition to adulthood. Again, vocabulary is chosen to reinforce the vulnerability of teenagers who are described as overwhelmed and bewildered, and the anxiety of the parents who are described as harried and wringing their hands in despair. Rhyme is used in the final lines, reinforcing the idea of the nursery rhymes and rhyming children's stories, and also the contrast between good and bad choices in the symbolism of the rhyming words sticks and bricks. The tone of the conclusion is one of continual concern without any resolution, reinforcing the idea that this problem is an ongoing one in each generation. You can see that the how questions are of paramount importance in establishing the poet's motivation and purpose. The poetic devices used are crucial to the reader's interpretation of the poem and their capacity to truly understand the poet's messages, not just at a superficial level, but with all the nuance and depth of the exploration of the subject matter. So, how can you ensure you have understood the architecture of the poem? Well, use the who, what, when, where, why, how framework, and those questions will become the doors that enable you to enter the poem's external structure and reveal the strong foundational ideas upon which it has been built. I hope you will add this approach to your poetry toolkit. May it give you more confidence and enjoyment as a reader and writer of poetry. There are more resources on my website and YouTube channel. Please feel free to use them all if you are keen to build your poetry skills, or if you are a teacher who wants to build your students' skills in poetry analysis and poetry writing. Until my next video, ciao for now.